average person can broad jump their height. So, of course, how many 6-foot people do we hire? And there are people in all different cultures that may not be 6 feet, including there's not a lot of women that are 6 feet tall that would not be able to get through that type of test.
Be systemic discrimination, but I'm trying to think of systemic racism.
In our that we have some questions, for example, in our aptitude test. And you know what, I might refer Gail, because that is Gail's specialty in the HR world.
That's something to see. Jumping over a 6-foot mat. What does that have to do with systemic racism within the RCMP? You saw Greg Fergus, Liberal MP, also head of the Parliamentary Black Caucus, saying, what you're talking about may be systemic discrimination. I wanted some examples of systemic racism, something that the Commissioner of the RCMP, Brenda Lucki, had denied existed. Then she said it does exist. She was just asked for an example. The example she had was that. People are asked to jump over a 6-foot mat, but some of them aren't tall enough. A lot of people were scratching their head at the Public Safety Committee yesterday as she testified before that, and she just could not figure out. And finally, you saw her. She just basically threw it over to one of her other officers. Does this show the RCMP needs a change in leadership? What do MPs on part of that committee think of their commissioner's response? Let's find out. A couple of them are here, and I think more may join. Tim Uppal is a Conservative MP in Alberta. Jack Harris is the NDP MP and the party's public safety critic. Let me start with you, Mr. Harris. What did you make of that? She was asked for an example of systemic racism, and I guess she talked about an obstacle course. I was scratching my head. What about you?
Well, you know, I think she doesn't get what systemic racism is. Some of the leadership of the RCMPs think it's systematic racism. Systemic racism is pervasive. Racism which has existed in the force for many, many years. One of the other examples last night, she was talking about the fact that they have a program to try to recruit Inuk members for the force. What she didn't mention was they haven't recruited a single person in the last 15 years who's Inuk. You know, she's talking about, well, we're training them to have driver's license. The examples that she was using of the training were rather, I mean, the kind of training where we have a blanket ceremony. Well, that's a half a day of a 6-month course. They have a module on suicide prevention. That sounds to me, and an online cultural sensitivity course. These are things that are very minuscule parts of what's going on in terms of a response to what has been acknowledged by the Prime Minister, by her eventually, and by the Minister of Public Safety as a systemic problem. We've got to find out, and whether it's Brenda Lucki or whoever is there, the leadership indeed, all have to understand what it is. I don't really want to focus on whether Brenda Lucki should go today or tomorrow. What we really need to focus on here is what are the things that really need to change. And I've got a kind of a list of them, but some of them have to be examined by this committee. This committee has good work to do. Why I wanted this committee to meet was so that we could start this conversation and get to the root of what needs to happen.
All right. Well, let me bring in Mr. Uppal. Mr. Uppal, Jack Harris says we don't want to talk about whether she should stay or go, but I think it's fundamental. She's the leader. She was appointed 2 years ago. What did you think of her answer on systemic racism, and what does it show you? Is she up for leading the transformation that she herself has talked about is needed in the RCMP?
I think her responses, for me, were really very much in line with the government, that they really have not put much thought into this whole issue. The government itself, for the last 5 years, they've been in government for 5 years. If this is such a big issue for them, like they said now, that there is systemic racism, we need to address it. Why haven't they done anything in the last 5 years? Even if you go back to Bill Blair's mandate letter to December of 2019, so just months ago, racism in the RCMP, or racism overall, systemic racism, wasn't even mentioned. So this hasn't been a focus for this Liberal government until, you know, this has become an issue for everybody else. So if this was an issue, why haven't they been dealing with this? And even from the commissioner's answers on many issues, I think she, she reverted back to the number of men and women on the force, men and women in management. That's because that's what her focus has been, and that's what she's getting from the Liberal government. So yes, that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. But for the Liberal government now to come forward and say, well, there's all this systemic racism and we have to tackle it. Yes, thank you. But why? What have you been doing for 5 years?
Let's bring in Pam Damoff, a Liberal MP and the Parliamentary Secretary to Indigenous Services Minister. Pam Damoff, the Prime Minister has said there's systemic racism. The Commissioner of the RCMP first denied it, then she admitted it. Then the best example she had when she was asked by your own colleague, Greg Fergus, was this obstacle course, how does your government still have faith that someone that cannot name an example of systemic racism or names that is still the person that's best to lead the transformation to root out systemic racism in the force?
Well, you know, Evan, I'm not going to judge the commissioner by one answer at a committee. Systemic racism is something that all of us are acknowledging now. And quite frankly, we have been doing things over the last 5 years. Investing in First Nations policing, we need to do so much more. And this is something that we have to take action on. And I'm going to judge Commissioner Lucki by her actions going forward and how we do make changes. We have
Pam Damoff, can I just to be fair?
Yeah.
The RCMP saw the video of Chief Adam, who was just on our program. They said, hey, that's a justifiable use of force. When it was made public, the charges mysteriously were dropped. She denied there was systemic racism. She just couldn't have an example. How many chances is the Commission of the RCMP, which your government installed 2 years ago, to get at this very problem? And she has revealed on countless occasions she either doesn't understand the problem or can't even define the problem or find an example of the problem. So why is it so difficult to say whether she's up for the job or not?
Well, but Evan, there's far more examples than just Chief Adam. A woman should be able to call the RCMP and not be arrested. You know, if they call for domestic violence, be arrested for breaching probation. I mean, we've got problems that we have to solve. And I think our government recognizes it. We need to work with Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians. They need to have a meaningful role in what we do moving forward. There's accountability and discipline that's needed in the RCMP. I mean, there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution here. And I think the government is committed, and we are going to make sure that the RCMP moves forward on changing systemic problems within that organization.
Mr. Harris, is that good enough for you, sir?
No, it's not really. I mean, we've had attempts internally. We heard from Jody Wilson-Raybould the other day saying that she was the Attorney General and she wasn't listened to. She was very, very keen to follow through on the promise that was made in 2015 to end mandatory minimum sentences, which is accounted for the overrepresentation in the prison system by 7 times of Indigenous people in our jails, and she didn't get listened to, got put away. We've now got the Justice Minister Lametti, who signed on to the Black Caucus Declaration, which also says eliminate quickly mandatory minimum sentences. Is he going to do it? We don't know, but that's one of the systemic problems, systemic racism issues. And we want to get this committee to, I want to get this committee to help us understand, help the country understand what systemic racism is, because we have to seize this opportunity to actually root out those things by bold, concrete actions. And that's going to take more than getting rid of Commissioner Lucki. We'll find out what we need to do, and then we'll decide who has to do it.
And
I only got just a last word. I got to get Mr. Uppal in to be fair for time. Mr. Uppal, last word to you, sir.
You know what? I mean, this goes back to the Liberals talking a good game, but no action. Yesterday, the minister couldn't even tell us 5 years ago where they were with the demographics of the RCMP, where they've come forward. How many more Indigenous Canadians have they hired? More Black Canadians, more other racialized Canadians. Where were they 5 years ago? Where are they today? If they were working on it, they would know. They couldn't even answer that yesterday. So again, what have they been doing for the last 5 years? It's good to identify it now. It's good to join everybody else to say that this is a problem, but this is not something that they have been addressing. They failed Canadians in this part.
All right. Unfortunately, just because of time, Ms. Damoff, I know you want to jump in, but we've got to unfortunately run out of time, but we'll do this again. Pam Damoff, Mr. Harris, Mr. Uppal, thank you all. I really appreciate you joining us.